Hello, everybody. Welcome to a research recap here on this 18th of September. I'm excited for you to listen in. I have decided on a little bit of a new format when it comes to these research recaps or research groups, but I want to continue with them on a weekly basis in order also to hold myself accountable to continuing to read research, but also, of course, for you guys, for anybody interested in the latest research. And most people probably know that reading scientific research can be quite daunting, even just in the length of a particular paper, but also the form that they are often written. Kind of confusing, or numbers, and then we go into the methods and what does that actually mean. And most of the time we just want to know, what can I take away from this? What does that mean for the practical application for myself in terms of health, or for my training, for my nutrition, but of course also for us coaches who want to pass something on and who want to improve in the way that we are coaching. So today's paper is titled Maximizing Muscle Hypertrophy, a systematic review of advanced resistance training techniques and methods. Don't worry if you can't quite read that on the screen yet. I will go into a bit more of a slideshow and hopefully you can read that better on there. But of course, I want you to mostly listen, and I will do my very best to explain the specific contents of it. This was a paper written by, please forgive me how I'm pronouncing this name, Krzysztofik et al., and it was published in 2019, so it's not in the too distant past. Before I properly start, I would love for you to hit the subscribe button, to potentially comment with any ideas or any feedback that you have for me. Also, if there are particular studies that really interest you that you would like me to review in the future, then do not hesitate to comment, or just in general if you have questions about what I'm about to say. But yes, thank you so much for being here, and we are going to get into Maximizing Muscle Hypertrophy, a systematic review of advanced resistance training techniques and methods. So here we have my slideshow. Just give me a bit of a second. One moment. I am still always struggling to bring up the things. Here we go. Hopefully you can read that okay now. So again, maximizing muscle hypertrophy, meaning we want to maximize the amount of muscle that we are growing. A systematic review of advanced resistance training techniques and methods. And I am really not even going to go too much into the particular methods, into even the study design or whatever. This is not a study, this is a systematic review. So obviously they gathered a bunch of different studies and reviewed them and then came to their conclusions. But what I want to focus mostly on is just what does that mean practically in terms of takeaways. So the objectives of this systematic review was to examine the effectiveness of advanced resistance training techniques in comparison to traditional approaches, to identify the most beneficial training variables for maximizing muscle hypertrophy, including mechanical tension and metabolic stress, and to analyze previous studies to assess the implications of various resisting training methodologies. What drew me to this article was that it really specifies advanced resistance training techniques. We know that in the beginning, if you are completely new to resistance training, pretty much anything is going to elicit some kind of change. You're probably going to respond to a 2-day training program super easily that just includes your 3 sets of 10 for squats and deadlifts and presses, and you're good to go for the next 4 or 5 years if you just do them consistently and in good form without injuries. Bam. 45 minutes each session, sort of thing. But at some point we want to add volume, or we need to add volume in order to continue to grow. At some point we might get bored of these exercises, and then what do we do, particularly if we're talking about someone like you, or perhaps myself as well, who has been training for over 10 years now in terms of resistance training, and we do kind of need to look into more advanced, or we want to perhaps want to look into more advanced methods. If you're someone who's like, hey, I never get tired of doing squats, deadlifts, and presses, I can do 3 by 10 for the rest of my life, and I continue to see growth, I continue to get stronger, and I continue to be injury free and feel great. Awesome. By all means, continue with that. You do not need to change a single thing. Why change something that's not broken? But for the majority of people, that's not the reality once they hit 5, 7 years or longer. So again, I am not wasting any time in terms of methods, or because again, like they just used search engines to gather various studies. They had various inclusion criteria of like, okay, advanced needed to be defined as at least 4 years of training, at least being able to hit this and that weight for particular lifts, and so on. So of course there was a variation between the studies. They did not happen to find 100 that just all assess the exact same thing. That would be lovely. Well, not necessarily, but yeah, anyway. And of course, they also had a range in terms of participants. Some of the studies only included 10 people, other studies included 25, some studies were male only, some were mixed. So this is what a systematic review essentially is. And then, of course, going through exclusion criteria. Let's just say if there were at some point only 3 people in a study, they did not use the study for the systematic review because they did not deem that was not in the inclusion criteria. But let's go into the key findings. So number one, one of the key findings was that we're probably best off to have a combination of various techniques. Effective hypertrophy-oriented training should include a mix of mechanical tension and metabolic stress. And we're going to go into what each one of those means in a little bit as well. But yeah, essentially, basically a mix that again, that shouldn't be super surprising that we should not just do one thing all the time if we're advanced, or the same thing all the time using the same weights, or just doing the same exercises. Also in terms of training volume and intensity, and this is a bit of a caveat because later on it's going to say we can't give specific advice, but just from gathering this information from these studies, it is probably best to have multiple sets, which they classified as somewhere between 3 to 6, of about 6 to 20 repetitions, with rest intervals of about 60 to 120 seconds, and moderate to high intensity, so about 80% of your 1 rep max, which is what they recommend for maximum hypertrophy. We're not talking about strength here. This is a particular systematic review and meta-analysis that looked at hypertrophy. So for strength, you probably would see larger rest intervals. You would probably see fewer repetitions, and you might see different kinds of sets as well, or higher loads as well. So this is a rough recommendation, but again, one of the other future key findings I'm going to talk about is actually kind of not contradicting this, but is putting it into brackets. So then we have the third key finding, when it comes to advanced techniques, trained athletes may benefit from integrating advanced resistance training techniques, big surprise, to break through plateaus and prevent monotony in training. That's kind of common sense. When it comes to being more time efficient, even as an advanced lifter, you could use techniques like agonist-antagonist supersets or cluster sets, which may offer time-efficient training solutions, especially again, if you're under time constraints. Let's just say you need to add more volume, but you only have 45 minutes. So you could do your bench press and then go over and do your row right afterwards, and then only rest a minute and then do the same thing again, as opposed to doing the bench press, resting 2 minutes, doing the bench 2 minutes, bench 2 minutes, and then doing your row. And in fact, there might actually be some benefits for our hypertrophy when doing that, or cluster sets where we just, we do a set and then just a very short break, another set, short break, another set, short break, and then a larger break. So just some time efficient advanced techniques here. Then number 5, they stated that while advanced techniques may provide benefits in terms of muscle thickness and metabolic stress, chronic effects on hypertrophy did not significantly outperform traditional methods. So I have to be entirely honest, I did not really understand what they meant by that. Of course, I'm kind of taking it that with the more advanced techniques such as supersets, cluster sets, etc., we are probably well off for hypertrophy, so muscle thickness, and just causing metabolic stress or lactate accumulation or whatever it might be, but did not outperform traditional methods. When it comes to chronic effects, they did not necessarily define what they meant by chronic effects. Perhaps more the soft tissue or like tendons or just in the long run. But yes, I have to be honest, I did not get that from this paper. Sixth key finding was that initially in the early stages of resistance training, and again, this is sort of logical, and that's why that paper was actually looking at advanced resistance training techniques. But in the early stages of resistance training, we usually make advances due to neurological adaptations, even if it is as an advanced lifter, but you're using a new technique. That's often why when you get a new training program that includes new exercises, you're a little bit more sore initially, just also, or you feel like you need to get into a groove of things because your body needs to assess at first how to actually recruit all the necessary motor neurons and how many of them and so on. But afterwards, once we have neurologically kind of adapted to a new stimulus, that is when we're getting more of the muscle protein synthesis, or just in general the metabolic adaptations when it comes within the muscle. Yeah, sort of. They were saying sort of after 6 to 10 weeks. That's what they gathered from the studies that they included in the review. And then this is what I meant in the last one. They stated that there is a lack of being able to provide specific guidelines because the studies included had such a such big variations from one to the other. There is insufficient evidence to give specific guidelines for volume, intensity, and frequency of advanced resistance training techniques. Nonetheless, they kind of like overall did give that guideline of 6 to 20 repetitions, 1 to 2 minutes rest in between, 3 to 6 sets roughly. So what did they actually mean by advanced techniques? These in this systematic review included drop sets, included cluster sets, included supersets, which here ideally done in the manner that was stated. So agonist-antagonist, meaning opposing muscle groups. So if you're doing a push movement and then a pull movement. But there is also the use of supersets where you're just fatiguing one particular muscle more. Let's just say you're doing bench and then you're doing flies to hit the chest even more, the pecs even more. So it is more fatiguing though, and it totally depends on your training split, because if you are doing a 3-day training split and you're using your full body in every training session, then it might be better to do the agonist-antagonist as opposed to if you're doing body part splits and you are just hitting your chest and your triceps one day, then totally you can do the same muscle group in sequence. Blood flow restriction training is primarily, actually, in my opinion, used for injury recovery, or if you have very light weights only available. So for instance, during the pandemic, a lot of people used blood flow restriction training. Let's just say you only had a few dumbbells at home and you were squatting, like front squatting, kind of goblet squatting with them, and it started feeling super light even for 20 reps. And you don't really want to do that much more than 20 because it gets tiring, it gets fatiguing. So what you would have been able to do would have been using that, I'm going to call it like floss band or whatever, like a black band usually, and you tie it around your thighs perhaps, or the area that you wanted to target, and then you do squats, and you do not need a lot of load for that at all, which is why it's so great for injury recovery, really, because you can often use no load at all and still get a really, really good almost like a pump going in particular areas. But of course, it's not so ideal for certain muscle groups as it is for others. Like, how are you going to hit your glutes as well? Not as well as your quads, probably. So the accentuation of eccentric loading. So eccentric loading is essentially the phase where we're lowering the weight. So let's just say deadlift, you have your weight standing up and then you're lowering it back down. Or in a bench press, it would be on the way down as well. So the lowering phase and the accentuation can be in numerous ways. It can just be longer, slower. It could also be heavier. So let's say with what do you call them? The chains, for instance, or sometimes if you're doing it on a machine, people even actually have a spot or have a friend or their gym buddy pressing down on the weights so that the eccentric phase is harder as well. Yeah, so that would be one thing. Sarcoplasmatic stimulating training, SST. I will be honest and also admit that I don't actually know what they meant by that. I will do my due diligence after this. I should have looked into that before recording, but I will do my due diligence and put that in the show notes once I have found out, just so you can go and actually take a look at what that is if you would like to include that. Actually, as a matter of fact, I'm going to do that for all of these techniques, including the drop sets and cluster sets and supersets, even though most people probably know what that is. And I mean, lastly, the time under tension is really, it's not a specific technique. I wouldn't call that like an advanced training technique, to be honest. I think it's just moderate or alternating tempo from your usual, let's say 1 second here, 1 second holding, 1 second there. It might be, let's say on a squat, you're using 5 seconds for the descent, then you're holding 3 seconds in the bottom, and then you're trying to explode up, and then you're doing the same thing again. That sounds absolutely horrible in my opinion. But nonetheless, that is what you can do as a more advanced technique. Also a great technique for making lighter weights more challenging for you. What I did want to look into or just explain to you more closely is what do they actually mean by mechanical tension, so that time under tension increasing. It refers to the force exerted on muscles during resistance training. So when we lift weights, the muscle experiences stretching and contracting, which generates tension. So that is literally all that we're talking about with mechanical tension. And it sounds super broad, sounds super vague, and sounds like, what? Technically, am I exerting mechanical tension even just standing? I mean, isometric exercises per se or exercise execution per se can indeed certainly induce mechanical tension. However, it needs to be challenging. Like if you haven't stood in a month and suddenly you're standing up, yes, you are creating mechanical tension. But if you stand all day long and your resistance train, you're not going to challenge your muscles enough just by standing to create an adaptation. So we need to look into other ways. That's why we have started resistance training, because we're no longer in just everyday life creating enough mechanical tension to actually see muscle hypertrophy or an adaptation. As it pertains to the metabolic stress, so both of these are ways to induce muscle hypertrophy, and usually they happen in conjunction. But when it comes to metabolic stress, what they were referring to was the results from the biochemical processes that occur when muscles are working. It refers more to the accumulation of metabolites such as lactate, hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, and so on during intense exercise. So I think, like if I'm trying to picture it, mechanical tension, I literally picture the tension on the tendons, on the muscle, and so on. So let's just say you have a band as a way to picture, or even my hair, if you is a way to picture the muscle, and you have that tension, which in and of itself creates an adaptation, and the adaptation or that tension might lead to byproducts such as lactate, such as hydrogen ions, especially if you have a contraction and not just isometric movement, so to speak, or exercises, and so on. And these byproducts are more in the longer run going to cause the adaptation. The other thing is, of course, the neural adaptation that I was referring to that usually happens more at the beginning of an adaptation process of a new training program, of a new type of training, a new exercise, etc. And that refers to the changes that occur within the nervous system in response to strength training. These adaptations are essential for enhancing overall muscle performance and strength before any significant muscle growth occurs. And this is like probably the more looked into factor when it comes to strength increase, as this is already alluding to. So when we are training as a power lifter or for maximal strength for 1 rep maxes and so on, we really want to help that neural adaptation as much as possible. We can often do that through consuming the right amount of healthy fats as well, through really activating our nervous system before going into lifts, for example, with some plyometric work, or just being switched on with caffeine, or however else we get into the zone. Whereas if we're just looking at hypertrophy, that is not as important as like creating that tension. Oops, sorry, going back. So my takeaway from all of this, from the systematic review and meta-analysis, was that by strategically incorporating advanced resistance training techniques such as drop sets, supersets, and accentuated eccentric loading, you can manipulate these factors, so neural adaptations, mechanical tension, metabolic stress, to achieve hypertrophy goals effectively, or to break through your plateaus, to even just get a new stimulus. I don't know about you, but I get excited about new machines, a new training program, and I'm like, oh, cool, I have not tried this before. Often when I look at that and like a new program on paper and I'm excited, after the first week or two, I'm like, yeah, I know why I didn't do that before. It's freaking hard. For instance, when it comes to the tempo, or even with the cluster sets, I had a while ago, I had a training program. Oh my gosh, it was brutal. It was asking me to do 10 sets of squats. No, hang on. So it was 10 squats, rest 10 seconds, so you could like hardly rack it. Another 10 squats, rack it. Another 10 squats, so I think 5 times. And then you actually got 3 to 5 minutes rest. And then you were to do that another 2 times. It was horrible. And like any weight that you start off with is going to be too heavy. Like even if you just have, I don't know, 50% of your usual weight on there, when you get to that last set, you are going to want to just like cut your legs off. I mean, if you have ever done German volume training or anything like that, that it's a little bit similar. Like start off with a lighter weight than you think, but at least you get like proper rest between your sets. But yeah, that was just absolutely horrible. I do like supersets at the moment with my current training program, which is more of so I do 3 days of lower, I do a shoulder day and a back day. And so supersets at the gym that I go to doesn't really work that well. And I feel like I can connect to the muscle better and focus more on like the time under tension when I don't do supersets. Like supersets was great when I was more rushed in my training, when I was training more for strength and just like had full body splits with CrossFit or whatever. But I don't incorporate supersets at the moment. I have never done eccentric. Well, I've played around with like chains before, but I've never had like someone actively push down on my load. I have certainly done other time under tension extension techniques, like even just segmenting deadlift. So for instance, doing like an RDL, and on the way up even, so you would stop for 2 seconds halfway through, or on mid shin, 2 seconds below the knee, 2 seconds above the knee, and then up, and then lowering down for 4 seconds. So like it was brutal, like, it took a long time. One rep took, like, what felt like forever, and then you were supposed to do 10. So yeah, certainly not great. I have also played around with the supersets being agonist-antagonist, but also supersets for the same muscle groups, particularly for lower body. I've done that a few times, and I think it's a great way to get an actual, like, pump going and to really feel a particular muscle group even better. But yeah, I would love to hear some of your favorite advanced resistance training techniques. If you are currently implementing any in your training program, which ones are your favorite, which ones you really don't like, please leave me a comment. And yeah, just in general, if you want more free content, check out my Instagram, Nutrition Coaching in Life. Send me an email, at least at Nutrition Coaching in Life. We also have a website with lots of blog posts. And if you want to read the entire article, you will find the link in the show notes, as well as my explanation for the advanced techniques that were mentioned in these studies. Also, I should say that there are plenty more advanced resistance training techniques. These mentioned in this paper were just the ones that were included in the studies that were assessed in the systematic review. So I should have probably said that earlier, but anyway, thank you so much for listening. Once again, if you enjoy this, please do me a favor and subscribe, give me a rating or a comment or anything like that. Also, I have a podcast, also Nutrition Coaching, Nutrition and Life, and we bring out a new episode every Friday. You will also find that here on YouTube, as well as, of course, on any other podcast platform. Thank you so much.